Welcome to Ship Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort.
And I'm Dalton Gentry.
And we are here for the first of a 16-part series as we... Dalton, you hate everything. Stop shaking your head.
It's 16 parts.
Are you going to be showing up anyway?
Maybe.
We might as well have something to talk about,
We'll see. What are we reading?
It, by Stephen King.
The world's longest book.
It's not the world's longest.
Look at this.
It's a big book.
How do you read this?
I want to know how your book and my book, but your section was 10 pages longer than mine.
Like, normally when I'm reading, like, I'll, sit up in, like, bed or something like this and read like this. It's impossible with this thing. You can't sit it down anywhere because it's just too big. You can't mark on this side because there's no way to get it on the desk.
Extra salty. Extra salty, Dalton.
Anyway, what did we read this week?
We read part 1, The Shadow Before. In my book, it's 1 through 135.
Mine, it's 1 through 145, because why not? Yeah.
So, okay, before we get into this, we've got a wrap-up to do on what happened. We're going to let Dalton cool down for a second.
So, what happened? The Shadow Before. We open a week into biblical flooding in 1957 Derry, Maine, as young George Denbrough chases a paper boat. A paper boat which was crafted by his brother, Stuttering Bill. The boat zips through the gutters until it washes down a sewage drain where old Bob Gray lives. Bob is also known as Pennywise the Clown. Pennywise the Clown is also known as It. When little Georgie reaches in to retrieve his boat, Pennywise helps himself to an appendage instead. Flash forward to 1984. Adrian Mellon and his boyfriend are exiting a local bar when some bad guys recognize Adrian and beat him nearly to death before throwing him over a bridge and into the stream below, where awaits old Bobby Gray. Pennywise the Clown claims Adrian as his own, and no one argues much. During the bad guy's trial, the clown isn't mentioned, and the bad guys go to jail. Enter intros. Stanley Uris is a well-to-do accountant who loves his life and loves his wife and loves his job. Hell, he even loves living in Atlanta despite being from the Northeast. But one evening, he gets a call from an old friend. And one lonely bath later, Stanley Uris is dead. Rich Tozier is the man of 1,000 voices coming to you through KLAD fame in beautiful Los Angeles. He gets a call from Mike Hanlon, childhood buddy. Turns out Richie, he promised to return to Derry in case of it, and he has to pull quite a few strings to get his leave. But he does leave. Ben Hanscom is a world-famous architect who happens to live in a part of Nebraska that sounds to have been ripped from the pages of a Louis L'Amour parody. He too received a call, the call of retrieval. To celebrate, he goes to his usual watering hole, the place where he normally orders 2 beers, and he downs a 5th of wild turkey and a couple of swigs. Partner. Poor Eddie Kasprek doesn't know what's good for him, so he takes everything. And he ended up marrying his own mother for good measure. He has to leave her to assume his business of driving around Al Pacino so he, too, can return to Derry, Maine, where something awaits him. Something awaits him. Bev Rogan, formerly Beverly Marsh, had better know what's good for her, because she married her father, and he's a mean son of a bitch. She gets Mike's call late at night, and that makes her husband none too happy. He decides to lay the law down after her call, but Beverly has places to go, things to see. Stuttering Bill Denbrough has grown up to be a successful novelist who is not attractive and writes horror novels and is always sort of weird and awkward, and we're left to believe this is a representation of someone in King's life. Clive Barker, probably. He's in England shooting a movie about one of his books with his wife. But he has to leave. They all float.
Okay. So,
It.
how did you feel about it? We shouldn't start with how you felt about it, because I know how you felt about it.
Okay,
Should we
so-
jump straight into the analysis?
Wait, so I believe in high school I tried to read it.
Yeah, I really shouldn't give you openings to complain.
You should not. And I do recall some of this, a lot of the scenes. And of course, there was a very iconic scene with Georgie. Everybody knows that.
Well, here's, if I could interject.
Please do.
The weird thing, how many Stephen Kings have you read? Just a couple, right? Just a few? Three, maybe?
4.
The weird thing you'll notice about Stephen King is you're going to say that iconic scene a lot.
Okay.
Stephen King, I'm not a fan. And it's weird because Stephen King's one of these writers that I find myself always having to defend the fact that I'm not a fan of, because I can speak at length about everything I've read from him.
Okay.
And the reason is he paints scenes that are inevitable, that are indelible. He paints scenes that... So reading this first 135 pages, this first section of this book, I realized just how much of this book I remember. Okay. I've read it once, 4 years ago.
Okay.
Maybe twice. I don't think it was twice, though. I know I've quit it at least once. And I've quit it at least twice, because I tried to read it at the end of grade school, I believe.
It's a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
The thing that I didn't recall that I got for this time is, holy God, there are a lot of characters in this. And they're just slung at you, left and right.
How do you not remember that? Well, I guess if you've never read it.
I remember reading it, I remember the kids and stuff, but the whole scenes with the sheriffs and all that, And then of course I've seen the movie.
The
I watched
sheriffs?
Yeah. Where they're doing the investigation on the murder at the beginning?
Oh.
Yeah, I couldn't even tell you any of their names.
Well, they're not that important.
Exactly. But there's 6, 7 characters that you're introduced to right off the bat that really are just kind of gone.
Well, but Stephen King is very, very good and very, very talented at... Those characters don't matter, and you know they don't matter, but he's able to distinguish them from one another anyway.
Fair.
None of that felt cardboard, did it?
No, and that is interesting. With all the characters, they are all unique. And I've got my mains written down here so I can kind of keep track of who's who.
The players.
The players. But when it comes down to it, it's non-linear. That it was 6 phone calls, is it? X amount of phone calls.
Right. What's non-linear about?
It's just kind of all over the place. You get these little different scenes, but each scene does feel unique, and you get a unique feel for each character and how they're kind of incorporated into this a little bit. It's interesting, and it's well done, and I really have no complaints about it. It's enjoyable. Thoughts?
You're saying it's enjoyable, but you're really not acting that way.
Well, I just want to yell at people and be mad about things. I can enjoy things and be hateful about them.
So on writing, one of the things that Stephen King is sure to mention is that you don't write a story for literary significance.
Okay.
But if you notice some literary significance, it is your duty as the writer to play that up.
Okay.
Are you looking for something?
No, I was just going to have some quotes on hand, because I do think there are some decent little quotes in here.
Why are you going to jump into that when I'm talking about the literary importance of something?
Well, maybe they had some literary importance. I don't know.
Well, that's not by definition what literary importance
I can't
is.
pick up the book and have something on hand just in case?
Well, I'm afraid that what you're doing is you're not listening to what I'm saying.
What?
You're getting into the next Dalton point.
Okay, carry on.
So George and Bill's dad is named Zach, obviously Zacharias, which is from Hebrew. The Hebrew I can't pronounce it, Zakharyahu, which is Yahweh remembered.
Okay.
evoking the god, God remembered. There's a lot about forgetting in this first section, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
Boy, they forgot everything about when they were kids, didn't they?
Yeah, they forgot all about it.
But Zach, the patriarch of the George and Bill story, who worked so hard to stop the flooding and provide power from it, right? He worked to stop the flooding. He worked for the power company. It was a hydroelectric dam, wasn't it? I think, if I'm not misremembering, it was a hydroelectric dam on which he worked. It's awfully funny for somebody who comes from a place like Derry, isn't it?
I've never been to Maine.
Well, no. Well, I guess I don't mean. I guess I mean it's awfully funny for someone who comes from the place from whence it springs.
Okay.
Because he remembers. Zechariah. Yahweh remembers. The patriarch of the family remembers. Bill means the will to protect.
Okay.
Bill
That makes sense.
is the stereotypical strong older brother.
Yeah.
Did you catch Pennywise's real name?
It was very simple, like Bob something?
Bob Gray.
Bob Gray.
Robert. Do you know what Robert means?
What does Robert mean?
Robert means bright fame.
Okay.
Well, for somebody who... we're going to get a little bit more story of what Pennywise is, but for someone who presents themselves as a clown, bright fame is something that individual might chase, isn't it?
It's very clown-like.
Yeah.
You got
So,
some more?
well, let's go to the next Dalton point.
The doll boy. So, you've read On Writing.
Yes.
And Danse Macabre.
Yes.
Danse Macabre has the breakdown of different types of horror, correct? Fear of the unknown. Is that in there?
It is represented under the ghost, I believe.
This
Is he calls them what is the term? This is awful. Anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, this is very much fear of the unknown. And I think it's executed very well. And it's not something I really thought about until I was sitting down reading it this time. But we always get these constant throwbacks, these constant reminders to, the dank smell of the cellar. Just the ominous noise that you hear that you can't quite place your finger on. What is it? And it's it. It's actually well done. It plays on all these fears, all these childhood fears, and all these things that all these characters have built within them. These internal fears. And that fear of the unknown coming together into one tangible creature. It's very interesting, and it's well done. I like it.
Well, and further than that, more importantly perhaps than that, the very first scene that we get a lot of meat of the story about what's going on in Derry, Maine, right? Mm-hmm. There's a flood happening.
There is.
And because of that, everyone is scared, aren't they?
They are.
So it has come along and is feeding on this fear, right? Everyone is scared. Everyone is frenetic. Everyone is talking about, oh, it's been raining for 3 days. We might start to march the animals in 2 by 2. The next scene we get from 1984, everyone is scared. Adrian Mellon and his boyfriend are scared because they're homosexuals in a town that hates homosexuals.
Correct.
The bad guys in that scene are afraid they're going to be upstaged by him. Everyone is afraid. They're already afraid. They've been primed to be afraid.
It continues forward, though, as well.
Go on.
We get some anti-Semitism, correct?
Yeah.
It's another type of fear. They are afraid to go out in public because they are Jewish. So it's building on these individual fears of the characters. It's that unknown fear that's within us.
Right.
So yes, I agree with you.
So it is one thing that Stephen King has done very well here is planted the idea of fear itself in the reader.
Yes. And I think he makes it very relatable as well because, again, it's kind of a weird play of words, but it's that thing you're afraid of. And what is it that you're afraid of? You can't put your finger on it. It just is. It's that fear that we all have when we're kids. When we are Georgie, we're going down to the cellar. It's dark down there. It is that natural fear within us. And somehow he has capitalized that and turned it into a character. I love that. That's brilliant.
And then moving forward, so even moving forward, Eddie Kasprick, his mother is afraid of everything. Beverly, boy, we're getting hints that she was not from a very good household either, don't we?
Definitely afraid of her man.
Definitely, which seems to be, when contrasted with the section from Eddie,
Yep.
she seems to have married her father.
Oh, that's how it goes.
Bill was afraid because he lost his brother. He was afraid it was his fault. Golly, how many? Ben Hanscom was afraid because he was the big kid,
Okay.
right? So he was afraid of the way he looked. He was afraid of being upstaged because of that itself.
And that fear came back to represent itself in the scar that reappeared for him.
Stanley obviously was afraid of the anti-Semitism, and forgetting who's the guy that does voices. Richie. So the mechanism which rises in someone's self-conscious that makes them do the funny thing and be the funny guy is because they're afraid of who they really are and the fact that who they really are is inadequate. Humor is oftentimes, almost always, especially in children, a defense mechanism.
Yep. So, again, each character has their own internal fear, and it's all culminating into this one creature. It.
How strange are those fears, though?
Common.
Very
Very
common.
common. Absolutely every one of them.
So none of them is this strange, quirky thing, maybe besides Bill, but you can identify with that very readily.
Yeah.
Because you saw him give him the boat, and
Yeah, you lose somebody very close to you, that always weighs on you.
especially if it's you who gave them the tool
Correct.
by which to be lost.
Absolutely so. And it's well played. So far, it is very well played. I have really no major complaints about this. He builds it well. And he builds his suspense and he builds his horror masterfully. Because this kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat. You don't quite know what's going on.
Right. I do have one small gripe with the narration itself. The Flood of 31 was a long time ago, but we get this phrase in the book. There were still enough people around who remembered it to scare the others. Well, from that first section, anyone who's 35 or so is going to be old enough to remember it. This is one of the strange things that happens. So Stephen King was alive in 57.
Okay.
He was alive in 84. He'll be alive in 85 when some of the other narration takes place. He was not alive in 31. So to him, boy, 31 sounds like a long time ago.
Doesn't it, though?
You were born in 90?
90.
So, what, 1970?
It's a long time ago.
If you were writing a story about people who were alive in 1990 and you used the phrase, there were enough people around in 1990 to remember the flood of 70, it would make sense to you, wouldn't it?
It would.
Today, that's the same thing as saying there were just a few people around who remembered 9/11.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Okay, so it
There
didn't
was
play off well.
there was a few people around who remembered 9/11.
You're looking at an event on a global scale compared to an event on
Well,
like
no,
a small
but-
area.
There were enough people around in Kansas City that remember 9/11.
Fair.
It's the same phrase.
Okay.
Everyone in Kansas City is going to remember 9/11. Everyone in Derry, Maine is going to remember the flood of 31.
Okay.
So it's just one of those things that it's a strange trigger for a writer that before me is ancient history, and I might as well refer to it as such.
Okay.
Despite the fact that anyone over 35 in the part from 1957 is going to remember the flood of 31, right?
Fair enough,
Surely
yeah.
there's enough people over 35 still in that town. Although we will get some hints about why that phrase might make a little more sense later.
I think so. And if I may interject, that's really one of the hardest things to do with this novel, is to distinguish it and read it separately from the film version. I know what's going to happen in this. I know the novel is very different. But a lot of these things, they seem to be very, very similar tracks. Like, we know they're going to go back to Derry. We know they're going to confront it again. We know that they confronted him once as children. it's hard to distinguish that from the film itself because that film is so ingrained, at least
Are you
in my
talking
culture.
the Tim Curry film?
The Tim Curry film. I've seen the new
So,
one.
which was actually a TV series.
Really?
You didn't know that?
No.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a TV series.
I just know it used to come in a 2 VHS box set. And like that was the granddaddy of them all because it was a movie in 2 VHSs.
Yeah, I believe. I don't remember if it was a once a week thing that came out or if it was a like all week long. I think it was every night for a week that it came out. I don't remember, but I remember it when it came out.
Yeah?
Yeah.
If I recall, and like, I'm tangent and a side note now, Tim Curry has never taken credit for that role.
Really?
He's unbilled.
Have you seen all of the pictures of Tim Curry as it between
Smoking a cigarette under an umbrella.
Smoking a cigarette
which is
under an umbrella.
fantastic. But anyway, it is hard to distinguish these two things and kind of differentiate them because you know what's going on. You know the general story of it. That's why when you say, there are hardly any around, who remember that flood, you understand what they're getting at. There's hardly any around who still remember it. But you have to in this text. And if I understand correctly, the ending of this is extraordinarily different than the film version.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that'll be something we obviously address, 6 years from now when we finish it.
Yeah. I want to. So the saga of Georgie,
Okay.
so memorable, right?
Absolutely.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. You've tried to read this before, but quit, right?
Yes.
Do you remember that? Do you remember reading that versus seeing it on film?
Yes.
Exactly. It's very, very. I don't know how Stephen King does it, but he finds a lot of scenes that matter or makes the scenes he finds matter.
Okay.
But the one thing that is very easy to overlook in that scene, what does it call him? When it calls to him, hey, Georgie, right?
Okay.
So he knows his name.
Yes.
But it's not just that he knows his name. We get on page 6, italics,
Okay.
which are Georgie's thoughts.
Isn't there a little side notion where he wasn't even if he was older, he would have realized?
Oh, yeah, but
Anyway.
he calls himself Georgie.
Okay.
His name is George. He refers to himself as Georgie. Bill calls him Georgie, his mom calls him Georgie as well. But his name is George. So it's not, when Pennywise on 12 calls out to him, it is not that he calls him by his name. It's that he calls him by the name he calls himself.
Okay.
It is even deeper than calling him by the name he is called. He calls him by the name that he calls himself.
More familiar.
If you were walking down the street and someone yelled Dalton, you'd probably look. It's a unique name. But even when you look, if you didn't recognize that voice, there would be something in the back of your head that says, this person might not know me.
Fair enough.
If you're walking down the street and someone shouts salty,
Then you know.
then you know not only that they know you know where they know you from.
Okay.
He's Georgie to Pennywise. Pennywise knows how Georgie knows himself,
Okay.
which that is something which is fruitful later in the novel. Not necessarily about Georgie, but it is important to know that Pennywise doesn't know you. Pennywise knows how you know yourself.
Okay. So we'll have to see if that plays out later. Now, these fears that we were talking about earlier, we talked about a lot of them being, very warranted fears, very natural fears. A lot of them, however, are very manufactured fears. The idea of homophobia, anti-Semitism, anything you want to put along those lines.
Manufactured how?
They're more human fears. They're created because everyone else in the town is homophobic. And that's why this murder occurs. It's kind of interesting because it's not just this idea of this, creepy crawly in the back of the mind. The town itself seems to be feeding the creature. The town itself seems to be the reason for this. Because it seems everybody in this town has a problem with something. And they create the fear.
They feed the fear by feeding in the hate,
There you go.
right? All the graffiti is anti-something.
They even pointed out it was just so obscene, the graffiti, It was like unlike anything they'd ever seen before. So within this town, centered on hate, only then can this creature of evil exist. So I think there's a lot of good commentary on that.
Well, and it's weird. I am 5 years older than you. In that 5 years, I remember when there was graffiti everywhere,
Okay.
right? Do you really remember graffiti being everywhere?
Not really.
You know why?
Why is that?
You came along. By the time you were really
The internet happened. We had better things to do.
no. So people went from having to write stupid and hateful and crazy things on the underside of bridges or the back of a bus seat to being able to go to Twitter.
Okay.
It's not that they had better things to do, is they took those same stupid ideas and they had an alleyway that was known as Graffiti Alleyway. And they just got to focus there. But yeah, when I was a kid, there was graffiti everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, everywhere. And it was just stupid stuff written someplace. Kilroy was here, stuff like that. But there was also the stuff like is in this book.
Yes.
And this was this was before tagging. You know tagging.
Correct.
That was big when there was space to tag. Before that, if you put your tag someplace, it just looked like more graffiti on top of graffiti.
Okay.
And I'm from Kansas City. It's not like I'm from someplace where New York, Chicago, someplace like that. So I guarantee you this was an everywhere thing.
I'm from the town of Cameron. I remember some kids in my middle school got caught graffitiing. So they painted the walls and the church had them do church-based graffiti as punishment. Because that's...
Jesus was here.
I think it said Jesus is the way up. But they did the arrow and it was very edgy. And I remembered even hating it as a kid, so it's fine. Moving on. What else you got with this here?
It is interesting in that scene where we get something very primal. We get something very primal and something very symbolic.
Okay.
In the scene where Georgie wants to go get the turtle can of paraffin.
Okay.
Georgie is afraid of the dark.
Yes.
Very primordial, being afraid of the dark.
Fair enough.
Before we were us, we were afraid of the dark.
Dark's a bad place.
Dark's a terrible place. One of the main things that makes us us is our ability to construct and invent. By the time we could, one of the first things we were sure to get our grubby little mitts on was a power source. Where does Zach work?
The dam.
At the power source.
The power source.
So when Georgie needs to get that little can of paraffin, and the power's out, not even Dad can save you from it.
Okay.
Not even Dad's work can save you from the primordial.
Okay. And, for a 6-year-old like Georgie, Dad is the end-all, be-all. Dad can save me from anything. So, yeah, that's actually a nice little point there.
Dad is God.
That's a fine little flourish, Stephen King. And you still don't like Stephen King.
I like Stephen King.
Okay.
I like Stephen King enough. I will introduce this now.
Okay.
Because we have a very good example of it here. Stephen King does not try to tell you the story.
Okay.
Stephen King tries to tell you every story, doesn't he?
That's fair. And I both like it and don't like it so far in this reading. I think getting the unique character perspectives helps. It's nice. It's a good little flourish that you get there. Do I need to know the thoughts and aspects of every single character I'm given? Absolutely not. That original scene that starts the phone calls is with Stan, correct?
Yes.
And that's a well-done scene. That is brutal. Do we really
Stanley
need more
Uris
than
takes a
that?
bath. How do you mean? From Stan's wife's perspective?
Do we need any more character stories, other character stories from that? We know at that point the call was made. We know roughly what's going on. It's a return to Derry. We could have played with that a little bit more in the Stan scene. But we know that it is so dire that Stan's dead in the bathtub.
I think...
Because then after that, you move on to Richie. And Richie kind of sets up the whole, I have to go back to Derry. I have to go back. It's a promise I made. Those 2 scenes alone, all you need.
Well...
The other 6, give them the boot. Other 4.
I don't know that you can do that, because by the time we get to Derry, you don't know the other characters. Here's what I'm gaining more and more an appreciation for Stephen King. You have to realize the way that we were taught to read in university is not the way anyone else reads.
Fair.
These stories are not bad, are they?
No.
They are interesting, aren't they?
They are.
Are they absolutely necessary to get the main point across?
Nope.
Are they absolutely necessary that someone might build a relationship with one of these characters?
Yes.
That is the line which Stephen King plays, and plays so well, and it's the reason he sold more books than God. Because if this were a Hemingway novel, you're absolutely correct, those other scenes do not exist. We are left as the reader to build those connections with other people as we may or may not. Stephen King is not going to take that chance. Okay. Stephen King is going to tell you all these stories because he wants you.
It's pop fiction.
He wants you. He wants you invested. And it's hard to argue with the fact that investment is the way through which Stephen King is able to scare people's panties off, right? Because people are so invested in these characters, they feel like they know them. How many of these characters do you know?
All of them.
Boy, yeah, I know Bev's childhood. I know Eddie Kaspbrak's childhood. I know what that relationship is like with a younger sibling who looks up to you. I know what it's like to be the guy who's uncomfortable with yourself, so he makes funny voices, right?
Fair enough.
So all of these things are at play, and you're going to be a victim to them. Marilyn Monroe said that if you can make a woman laugh, you can make her do anything. I think that the same thing is true with fiction for any type of investment. Okay. If you can make a reader laugh, you can make them feel anything. If you can make a reader scared, you can make them feel anything. If you can get a reader's investment, you can make them feel anything.
It's all about the emotional investment.
So what we're doing here is we're planting these seeds of emotional investment. And Stephen King is going to try to drag you through the mud with them.
Okay.
It's like being hitched up to a truck. The more points at which you're hitched, the lesser the amount of chance you're going to get out of that son of a bitch.
Fair enough.
Send us out.
So we will be back next week with part 2 of a 16-part series, a Let's Read of Stephen King's. We will be reading Derry, the First Interlude, next week. If you'd like to join us with this, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. Give this video a like as well. We always appreciate it. And if you'd like to help us create more great content like this here on Strip Cover Lit, there's a link to our new and updated Patreon to be found in the description below.